Thank you very much for the invitation to attend this wonderful event. We're going to start in a different time. I'm going to take you back to the late 1800s. There is this American family visiting Europe. They are California residents, and they happen to be visiting Europe. England, Italy, and then Turkey. The government in Turkey invited the father of the family to visit there because he happened to be a very important rail executive. So they wanted to get his advice about establishing a rail network in Turkey. He went there with his wife and his only son, who was only 15 years old. The story goes great until they realize that the boy looks pale. He had contracted typhoid fever. At that time, an incurable disease. Yet, desperate, the family summoned doctors from Rome to communicate with him and to try to figure out what to do to save the boy's life. Unfortunately, 3 weeks later, the boy passed away. 2 months before turning 16. A family would have been devastated, and that was 1884. However, the family of Mr. Leland Stanford, his wife Jane, they turned the grief into an opportunity to create a new institution. They decided to found a new educational institution, what we call now Stanford University. Officially, it is still called Leland Stanford Junior University. The family had 8,000 acres of farmland in the San Francisco area. They deeded this land to the university with the promise never to sell any part of this land. From the following year and for the next 6 years, the family embarked on the project of starting a university that would provide a counterweight to the hollow institutions on the East Coast of the United States. At that moment, if you wanted to start a company, if you wanted to run for office, for example, you needed to have a stamp of approval from a university on the East Coast. They wanted to change that. And by acknowledging the importance of new technologies at that moment, for rail stations, for example, they realized that that was the way to move forward, to provide American kids and worldwide kids the opportunity to get an education on the West Coast this time. Only 6 years later, 1891, this university opened its doors, and a class of many students came, including a future president of the United States, Herbert Hoover. The university, from day one, needed funding, and this funding sometimes surpassed the money that was provided by the Stanford family. Yet, the government was there. The government was supporting the university because it was an alternative to the typical East Coast institutions. Now, why we start talking about Stanford? Because for many people, it is impossible to separate Stanford University from Silicon Valley innovation. Later on, student at the university, Frederick Terman, became a teacher after getting a degree at MIT. He actually decided to stay in Stanford instead of taking a professorship at Harvard. And he eventually became a tenured professor at Stanford. During the Second World War, he was invited to join a force that would be in charge of jamming radar systems in Germany. At that time, American and British fighters were actually losing their lives because they were being detected very quickly by the German forces. This team was in charge of analyzing the radar system and potentially jamming the signals so the fighters could do their job. When the war ended, he returned to Stanford, and he realized that there was a need there to cooperate with government. That was his inspiring idea, and that's what he took when he was assigned the position of Dean of the School of Engineering. Over the following years, he transformed the university from a purely educational institution to an education that actually can commit to support not only the purposes of the students, but also the general purpose of society and the country and the world. And for that, he implemented a radical set of measures at that time in comparison to other universities. One important thing was that graduate students were completely right if they wanted to obtain a PhD. However, he encouraged them. Why don't you take whatever you are researching, and instead of just focusing on finishing a PhD, why don't you instead think about starting a company? That was his inspiration. Not only that, he also invited teachers, professors, to not only stay in the education field, but also to actively support the efforts of the students to create a new enterprise, to start companies. And for that, he encouraged them, by example, taking board seats at these small companies at that time. That was unique. And in fact, he took a board seat in one small company started by two students of him. These two students were William Hewlett and David Packard, who at that time were researching an audio oscillator, a type of machine that helps you to measure radio frequencies. That was the first product for a small company later called Hewlett Packard HP. Today, we recognize how influential has been these type of measures. Equally, they also didn't want to focus education only on the students. For many SMBs, small companies that were sprouting around California, looking at the innovation coming from the rooms of the university, he also invited engineers coming from these companies to come to campus, to take classes. Even at that time, technology was moving fast. Innovation was happening constantly. Therefore, if you wanted to stay up to date, you needed to always go back to academia to see what students were doing, what type of research they were conducting. And for that, to keep them up to date, they decided to open the doors for industry to come to campus and to interact with students, professors, researchers. So Fred Terman, as dean of the engineering school, did a lot. And no wonder today people call him the father of Silicon Valley. There was another important character too, William Shockley. He was based on the East Coast, yet his mother still lived in California, where he had grown up. So he's a person who invented the transistor, a small device that soon enough was to replace the vacuum tubes. All radios, all TVs use vacuum tubes. Computers use vacuum tubes. But those computers occupy the size of this room or even more. They need so much power that when you turn on these computers, the lights of the city would flicker. That soon was to change with this new invention. The transistor was a new beginning, and only a few people realized the potential of this invention. Among them, Fred Terman, who invited Shockley to come to California and to start a company there and to commercialize this invention. He already had won the Nobel Prize. He could have stayed happily resting on his laurels, teaching at a very prestigious university. Instead, he started a company, Shockley Semiconductors. And he recruited the brightest minds out there. Of course, he was a great scientist, but he was an awful manager. So much that only 15 months later, after starting his company, 8 of his best researchers decided to leave the company. And they started another company, Fairchild Semiconductors. Shockley wanted to use germanium to build these integrated circuits. These researchers thought it was better to use silicon. When Shockley opposed the idea, they decided to go, to desert the company and to start a new one. And now the rest is history, because Fairchild was a very successful company. They invented an integrated circuit. And later on, 2 of these researchers started a company called Intel that is still successful in this field. And not only Intel, many other companies too. Just these 8 researchers started a number of companies. And this cycle repeated itself many, many times. So hundreds of companies could be traced back to these original companies in Silicon Valley in the 50s. Today, we sometimes talk about a PayPal mafia. PayPal, a payments company that was bought by eBay. This company was started by many people who are well known today work there. Reid Hoffman, Elon Musk, many of these people started there. Peter Thiel, and they later on started other companies. So the original mafia was this Fairchild, these Fairchildren, as they were called, who went around California and started different companies that even today are successful. Now, we already have the innovation there. We already have an institution there that is at the center of this innovation. We already have hungry entrepreneurs. What are we missing? Capital. We can only go as far with talent, with an idea. And the capital came actually courtesy of the Soviet Union. Because in 1957, when the satellite Sputnik was placed on orbit, that meant a wake-up call for America. So the American government decided to offer financing to small companies. So let's say if somebody wanted to invest in a company and offer, let's say, $1 million, the government offered to invest 3 times that amount, creating this initial wave of risk capital to the small companies starting in not only the West Coast, but all over America. So now the panoramic was getting complete. Now we had capital. Of course, there was an effort that was to stay only a few years, because eventually the private sector took that role. The government eventually was replaced by VCs, the venture capital firms of that time, that's in the 60s. And one of them was Hayden Stone, which was employing a fellow called Arthur Rock, who later started his own VC firm. But Arthur Rock played an important role in starting some of the initial firms in the VC space. Not only that, remember the 8 guys who left Shockley Semiconductors? When they left the company, because the boss, William Shockley, was not particularly effective as a manager, they initially were looking for jobs. So they sent a letter to Arthur Rock's colleague, asking them some suggestions about companies to work for. And he decided to meet these 8 people and ask them, why, instead of looking for jobs, why don't you think about starting a company? And that was the beginning of this company, Fairchild. And that was the beginning, too, of this structure. We had 8 people. We're going to divide the company. We're going to give 10% to each of these 8 founders, and the 20% is going to be to the financier, in this case, Arthur Rock. So that's how this 20% rate came about of the profits. So now we know that we have capital too, to provide a push to these companies trying to embrace new technologies. Today, we cannot imagine Silicon Valley without Stanford University. And this is not coming from me. This is coming from John Doerr, who now is the general partner at one of the biggest VC firms, Kleiner Perkins, that actually started around the 60s. In fact, if you remember here, one of these 8 guys was Eugene Kleiner, the founder of this VC firm. So the people there created this trend of technology, embracing risk, embracing change, that served them well. Today, we talk about Silicon Valley. But this term came only around in the 70s, in the early 70s. People were talking about the number of companies coming up in California that were focusing on the semiconductor industry. And because they were using silicon, a journalist took this term Silicon Valley, and the term caught on. Now we cannot imagine California without talking about Silicon Valley. We cannot imagine the semiconductor industry without talking about silicon. So now we know that Silicon Valley is a synonym with innovation, because that was an industry that was new. Nobody expected this industry to become so prevalent in our lives today. Yet, we cannot imagine our lives without our cell phones, our computers, our laptops. And it's all thanks to these semiconductors. Back in the day, these scientists were trying to figure out how to put these transistors into a chip. Today, Apple uses a chip that includes 16 billion transistors. Amazing. You can only imagine the improvement in capabilities compared to the computers that we had at that time. So today, big names like Intel, Netflix, Meta, Dell, Microsoft, many of these companies have either headquarters, offices, or research centers in Silicon Valley, meaning that the spirit of innovation is constantly renewed. And that's what happens when you think about looking at industry as a partner, not as people behind a wall, but as people who can actually help you and can be helped too. Because graduate students today are doing already innovations. They're already creating something that is going to be useful for industry. What do we do? By keeping them inside the walls of academia. We need to embrace industry. We need to invite people from other companies to see if they can take advantage of that. Of course, universities will think about licensing technology. The most famous example is actually Google. The 2 founders were working for 4 years developing a search engine. They wanted to sell this offer to the big search engine companies of the time, yet they were unsuccessful. However, the president of the university who spoke to them suggested, start a company, we will fund you. And that's what they did. And the rest is history. Yahoo had a chance to buy Google at that time, yet they declined. Now you can see which of these companies is still there. So the ecosystem fostering innovation will include, of course, a university. It'll include startups. The spirit of these companies starting up will also incorporate large organizations. And also we have to think about these research parts. One of the innovations of Frederick Terman when he was a dean at Stanford was to create Stanford Industry Park. The university had a lot of land, yet they were not able to sell it. Even though they wanted to get some money, they were not able to sell it. So they realized that they could rent it. And that's what they did. They created a big light industrial park for companies to come there. And Terman himself was going out speaking with companies, inviting them to come to campus to establish research centers there. We have the talent, we already have an ecosystem here, why don't you come? And many companies followed his advice and brought open office in this research center, in this industrial park that university was hosting in their own, next to the rooms, the classrooms where students were living. That was a big difference with other universities. So, from the examples that I gave you, you can see that the fact that we're talking today about Silicon Valley is because there have been a number of events, many of them fortuitous, something that nobody expected. We have seen tragedies, We have seen coincidences, yet there are some common themes. And common themes include failing. The failure is not final. Failure can be considered a necessary step before you reach success. And we don't need to go that far to find an example. LinkedIn, founded by Reid Hoffman, for example, was not his first endeavor. In fact, before starting LinkedIn, he started a company called SocialNet, which was supposed to be a mix of a dating app with a professional network. As you can imagine, when the goal is not clear, users were not particularly interested. So that was indeed a failure. Nonetheless, he learned a lot. And those lessons were helpful when he started his next venture, LinkedIn, a company that eventually was acquired by Microsoft for $26 billion. Another important lesson is collaboration, knowledge sharing. Robert Noyce, one of the founders of Intel, happened to grow in a rural area. He went to university in Ohio. Yet, one of his professors was in touch with the people developing the transistor. So he got all the recent papers about this new technology, and that him interested to start focusing on this technology. Ultimately, he became one of the founders of Intel. What I'm saying is that this curiosity not only kills the cat, this curiosity can also enhance innovation. The fact that professors, the fact that advisors, the fact that the presidents of the universities, or even the deans, can actually be sources of valuable information, valuable contacts. That is something that all students can embrace. So let's not stay only in our books, looking at them, but also embracing this communication with the people around us. Another important aspect, it's also diversity. It is a picture of a recent social meeting in the class 2023 of Stanford University. And as you can see here, it's not a coincidence that this is a very diverse picture. Back in the day, in the 50s, Caucasian students were more than 50%, I would say 60% of the classes at Stanford universities. Today, the number is only 28%, meaning that African Americans, Latinos, Asian, Africans, people from all over the world, from different ethnic nationalities, actually make a composition of today's classes at Stanford. And you can only imagine that people at Stanford, I would say most of them, will end up in Silicon Valley, in California. That is the type of diversity that we also aspire in companies. Because this diversity is not only about race, it's also about ideas. It's also about opinions. It's also about new ways to think. And that's what we also need to incorporate in companies. Because no matter how successful we are, if we maintain only the same way of doing things, we are never guaranteed that the success will continue. We always need to adapt. And how better this adaptation process than having the concurrence, the support of new people, new ideas. And we have to be open to new technologies. ChatGPT, Wenxin, those are technologies that we cannot escape today. As you see in some of these slides, I'm incorporating some pictures. And some of the pictures were squares. Yet, my slides, as you can see, are all widescreen. So what did I do? I used AI. In this case, runway machine learning. And this tool allowed me to expand these pictures. Very easy. The software gives me 4 different options to expand the picture. And I picked the one that is more convenient for my purposes. Let's embrace technology. No matter if you are the CEO or you are the customer service representative, you still need an opportunity there to leverage these technologies to provide a better service to your customers, to facilitate the goals of the company. That is something that we cannot lose sight. And this is another example too of how we need to think about technology. Because in my case, if you can Google me, you can find information about my career as a keynote speaker. I usually travel around the world and I present at major conferences. So far, 20 countries and hundreds of thousands of executives. Yet, technology is coming. And perhaps a keynote speaker coming to a conference might not be needed. Do I need to worry? No. 4 years ago, virtual speakers became the rage. We were not able to travel. So using Zoom, we were everywhere. Excellent. Now, the Metaverse is coming, and now we need to think about also the next stage. What about if they want me to speak in Chinese and I cannot speak Chinese? Well, I can train an avatar with my likeness to speak any language. That is the future. So Edgar Perez exists as an in-person speaker. Edgar Perez as a virtual speaker, it's also available. And if you want Edgar Perez AI to speak Chinese, Swedish, Italian, French, or whatever language, that's also available. That's how you embrace the future. So technology is not an enemy. Technology is an enabler. And your job might be not threatened by technology, but by another person using technology more effectively than you. So let's continue thinking that the main question, can we replicate Silicon Valley's culture of innovation? Silicon Valley itself is going through an evolution, through a transformation. 60 years ago, there was land. People from all over the world, all over the US, were going west because they wanted to start a new life. They wanted to start a new job. Land was available, land was cheap, rent wasn't expensive, there was not much traffic. Today, it's very different. Today, some companies are even thinking about moving some of their employees outside California to other states or to other countries. So there is not a good goal in replicating Silicon Valley. We can see some of the main ideas of how Silicon Valley became so important for innovation, and that's what we can take with us. However, I don't envision a new Silicon Valley, a new geographic location with such concentration of companies, richer, large, and other types of organizations. What I see, though, is that thanks to the evolution of technology today, I see distributed innovation, meaning that with the technology available today, I can get my team, no matter where they are, to cooperate, to work together, to embrace change, to embrace failure as a step before there's a final success. That's the spirit that we can replicate anywhere. So not geographically, but now thinking about a distributed approach, where innovation can happen anywhere as long as the main requisites, interest in innovation, this collaboration spirit, this spirit of collaborating with academia, businesses, research parks, and so on. So when we think about this level of spirit, we can actually think that innovation can also happen there. And that's the advice for all other cities that want to emulate that spirit of innovation. Thank you very much for your attention.